The days stretched into weeks, and the weeks into months, as Scarlett continued to work side by side with her mother, Helen, and her grandmother, Linda. The work was never glamorous. It was long hours of cleaning, fixing, and repairing. They worked together to transform the house and their lives, one small step at a time. But with every nail hammered, every brushstroke, and every small victory, something started to change. A transformation that was deeper than just the house. Scarlett was no longer just showing up to work out of guilt. She was showing up because for the first time in years, she wanted to. The sweat on her brow, the sore muscles at the end of the day, were not burdens to her now, but a sign of her commitment. She was building something real, something tangible. And it wasn't just the house that was being transformed, it was her heart. The house, once dark and overrun with the dust of years of neglect, slowly began to take shape again. The creaky floorboards were replaced with sturdy, smooth wood. The peeling walls were covered with fresh paint, a color that felt warm and welcoming. The rooms that had once felt so empty, so distant, now seemed to breathe with life. And with every change they made to the house, Scarlett felt something shift inside herself. Every task, no matter how small, was a step toward earning back the trust she had shattered. The process wasn't easy. There were still days of silence between them, days when the pain from the past crept into their conversations. But the tension was no longer as sharp. It was as if, with each passing day, they were building a new foundation, brick by brick, not just in the house, but in their hearts. One afternoon, as Scarlett and Linda were outside, planting flowers along the garden path, Scarlett paused for a moment, wiping the sweat from her brow. She glanced up at the house, now standing taller, sturdier, more whole. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe they could be whole again, too. "You've been doing good work, Scarlett," Linda said, her voice quiet but steady. She was looking at the garden, but Scarlett could tell her words weren't just about the flowers. They were about her, too, about the way she had shown up every day, not with excuses, but with effort. Scarlett looked over at Linda, her heart full. "I'm trying," she said simply. "I know I can't undo the past, but I can start now. I can start over." Linda's eyes softened for just a moment, a slight crack in the armor she had worn for years. "We'll see," she replied, her voice still carrying the weight of the years of hurt. But there was a flicker of something new there, a flicker of possibility. At the end of the day, Helen sat at the table in the kitchen, her tired hands resting in her lap as she watched Scarlett and Linda working in the garden. It had been a long day, full of small tasks and quiet conversations, but there was something different in the air. A sense of calm, a sense of something that had been lost for so long, now slowly returning. Scarlett walked over to her mother, who was sitting in the chair by the window, and sat down beside her. "I know it's not perfect, Mom. I know it's not easy, but I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere. This is my home now. I'm here for good." Helen looked at her, her eyes searching, as though trying to gauge the sincerity in her words. She had seen the pain in Scarlett's eyes over the past few months, the guilt that had haunted her, the determination to prove herself. It hadn't been easy for Helen to open up again. It hadn't been easy to allow her daughter back into her life after everything that had happened. But Helen had always been wise, always been steady, and she knew that time had a way of healing things, even the deepest wounds. "I believe you, Scarlett," Helen said softly, her voice full of quiet conviction. "You've shown me that you're willing to do the work. But you have to remember something. True forgiveness takes time. And so does healing. Don't rush it. Don't expect everything to be perfect right away. Just keep showing up every day with humility. That's all we need." Scarlett nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. She had spent so many years trying to run away from the past, trying to escape the weight of her mistakes. But now, sitting beside her mother, in this house they were rebuilding together, She felt the weight lift just a little. She had always thought that forgiveness was something that was given easily, that it was something to be asked for in the right moment, in the right words. But now she understood that forgiveness was a process. It was about showing up every day, not with perfect words or grand gestures, but with the work of a heart that had truly changed. As the weeks passed, Scarlett continued to work alongside her family. There were still difficult days when the silence was heavy, when the past felt like it was pulling them back. But there were more good days, more days when the walls seemed a little less thick, when the conversations lasted a little longer, when the laughter returned, bit by bit. The community, too, began to see the change. The whispers of Scarlett's return had started as gossip, as judgment. But now they had turned into something more. People started to see the woman she had become. Not the woman who had abandoned her family, but the woman who was working to rebuild what she had broken. Scarlett didn't expect everyone to forgive her. She didn't expect the community to accept her immediately. But she kept showing up, doing the work, living in the truth of her actions. One evening, as Scarlett sat on the porch with Helen and Linda, watching the sun set behind the hills, she reflected on everything she had learned. The past few months had been the hardest of her life, but they had also been the most rewarding. She had learned that forgiveness wasn't just about asking for it. It was about showing through action that you had truly changed. She had learned that humility was the key to healing, and that family wasn't just about blood. It was about showing up, every day, through thick and thin. And as the sky turned to gold, Scarlett knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, and the scars of the past would never fully fade, but they were rebuilding, together, and that was enough. With Helen and Linda beside her, and a family bond that was slowly but surely growing stronger, Scarlett felt a sense of peace settle into her heart. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. But for the first time in a long time, she was ready to embrace whatever came next, because she knew deep down that redemption wasn't just a destination. It was a journey. And she was on the right path. Scarlett stood frozen in the driveway, her hands shaking slightly as she looked at the packed car before her. The trunk, half filled with boxes and bags, was a physical representation of everything she was leaving behind, everything that had once been a part of her life. The house, the memories, the faces of her mother, Helen, and her grandmother Linda, seemed to watch her from every corner, as if the walls themselves held the pain of her decision. She closed the trunk slowly, almost hesitantly, the sound of the metal clicking shut echoing through the heavy silence. Her heart hammered in her chest. This moment, this decision was everything. She had always thought she would be different, that when the time came, she would be strong enough to choose what was best for her, to chase the life she dreamed of without hesitation. But standing here, in front of the only home she had ever known, with the only people she had ever loved, she felt small. She felt afraid. Scarlett took a deep breath, looking over her shoulder at the old house. The paint had begun to peel, the garden overgrown, but it still held traces of the life they once shared. The laughter in the kitchen, the quiet moments with her grandmother on the porch, her mother's comforting presence at the end of a long day. But now, all of that felt distant, like a dream slipping through her fingers. She could feel the weight of the choices she had made pressing down on her, but the whispers in her mind urged her forward. The promises of something better, a life without the constant reminders of struggle, the freedom to choose her own future, away from the suffocating grasp of responsibility. Michael's voice echoed in her head, cold and unyielding. "It's dead money, Scarlett. You have to let go. We can't keep holding on to this old house. It's a chain around your neck. You want a future, don't you? You can't have it while you're tied to your past." Those words had haunted her for weeks, no, months now. They had twisted inside her, growing, wrapping themselves around her heart, until she couldn't think clearly anymore. The decision had seemed so simple at first, like a path that led to a bright new world, a world where she could build herself, free from the burdens of her family's history. And for a while, it had felt like the right choice, the only choice. But now, as she stood in the shadow of the very home she had grown up in, she wasn't so sure. Her eyes drifted to Helen, standing just inside the door of the house. Her mother's face was calm, almost too calm, as though the years of struggle had finally stripped her of all emotion. She had never been a woman to show her feelings openly, but the absence of any reaction now was like a heavy weight. Was it acceptance? Or was it something darker? A kind of resigned silence that said she had already given up on her daughter? The truth of it gnawed at Scarlett's insides. She had told herself again and again that she had no choice, that this was the way forward. But the guilt was suffocating. Could she really leave them behind, knowing the cost? Could she turn her back on her mother and grandmother, knowing they would have to live the rest of their lives in this decaying house? Alone, the guilt twisted in her stomach, turning it into a tight knot. And yet, there was a small part of her, buried deep inside, that felt a flicker of relief. She had always wanted more. She had always felt that life had more to offer than this house, this life of obligation. The dream of something bigger, something better, had always been there, a constant companion in her thoughts. But in the face of the truth, in the face of what she was leaving behind, it all felt so selfish. And then there was Linda, her grandmother, the one who had raised her in the absence of a father, who had always been the emotional anchor in her life. Linda's face was drawn, weary with age, her hands folded tightly in front of her. She had seen everything, too much perhaps. And now there was only silence between them. No anger, no bitterness, just quiet pain. Scarlett couldn't read her expression, but she could feel the weight of the years pressing down on her. The knowledge that this moment, the moment of leaving, had irrevocably shattered something between them. As Scarlett stood there, she felt the years between them. The years of memories, of love, of sacrifices that had been made, all slipping away with every second that passed. She had promised herself this day would come, that she would be strong enough to walk away, to build the future she had always dreamed of. But now, standing on the edge of that decision, she didn't feel strong. She didn't feel free. She felt empty. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Michael's voice, calling from inside the car, urging her to hurry. The impatience in his tone made her feel even smaller. She had been standing here for too long, torn between two lives, and the reality of the situation was starting to hit. If she didn't leave now, she might never have the courage to leave at all. With a deep breath, Scarlett turned her back on the house, on the past, and started walking toward the car. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the earth itself was trying to hold her in place, to keep her from making the mistake she already knew she was making. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't turn back now. She had made her choice, and the path ahead was waiting for her. She got into the car, the leather seats cold against her skin. The engine roared to life, filling the air with a deafening sound that drowned out the quiet whisper of her conscience. For a moment, she sat there, frozen, staring ahead, knowing that once she pulled out of this driveway, everything would change. Everything would be different. Her mother's face flashed through her mind. Helen standing on the porch, her eyes filled with quiet sorrow, silently watching her leave. The image lingered, but she pushed it aside, telling herself it was for the best. She had to let go. They would be fine. They had always been fine without her. Scarlett put the car in gear and pulled away, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The house grew smaller in the rearview mirror, fading away like a shadow in the distance. With each passing second, she felt a strange mix of relief and dread. The road ahead was long, and the future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, she was moving toward something new. As the house disappeared from view, a single thought echoed in her mind. What have I done? 20 years. 2 decades had passed since Scarlett had walked away from everything she once knew. Her life now was a world away from the dusty roads of her childhood, the worn-out house that had crumbled along with the ties that once bound her. She lived in a luxury apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a skyline that gleamed with promise. But despite the opulence, the wealth, and the extravagant lifestyle, a hollow silence followed her wherever she went. Her days were filled with business meetings, fancy dinners, and cocktail parties, but none of it felt real. None of it felt like home. Her apartment, with its polished furniture and cold, unfeeling luxury, was just a shell. She had filled it with things: expensive art, expensive clothes, expensive everything. But none of it could fill the emptiness that gnawed at her from the inside. Scarlett sat at the sleek glass desk in her high-rise, staring out at the city below. The distant lights sparkled like stars, each one a beacon of success. She had everything she thought she wanted, everything she was supposed to want. But as she sat there, the silence pressed in on her, thick and suffocating. She thought of her mother, Helen, and the weight of her absence. She thought of Linda, her grandmother, whose loving face she could barely remember, hidden behind years of guilt and regret. Her fingers traced the edge of a photograph on her desk, the only picture she kept from those days. Her mother and grandmother smiling, their faces full of hope and warmth. The memory of those days felt so distant now, like a different lifetime, a different version of herself, a version of herself that had been full of love, full of purpose. But that version had faded, buried under years of ambition and selfishness. What happened to me? Scarlett whispered to herself, the words more like a plea than a question. She had everything she had ever dreamed of: wealth, status, the perfect life. But deep inside, she was nothing more than a hollow shell. The person she had become was someone she didn't recognize. In the stillness of her apartment, Scarlett's mind wandered back to that moment, the moment she left. She could still hear her mother's voice, quiet and sad, still feel the weight of the decision that had shattered everything. She had thought she was making the right choice then, leaving for a future, for a better life. But now, all those things felt meaningless. The house, the family, the love she had left behind, nothing could replace that. Nothing could fill the void that had been carved into her heart the day she made the choice to abandon them. The guilt came in waves, crashing over her in the quiet. Moments when she wasn't distracted by the noise of the world. It was there when she woke in the mornings, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts, and it followed her throughout her day, like a shadow she couldn't escape. The more successful she became, the heavier the guilt weighed on her. The more she had, the more she realized how much she had lost. But the worst part of it all, the part that cut deepest, was that she hadn't even truly left for herself. She had left because of a lie told to her by someone she trusted, someone who had convinced her that abandoning her family was the only way to survive. Michael had been so sure of it, so confident that cutting ties with her past was the way forward. But now, after all these years, she realized how wrong he had been, and how wrong she had been to listen to him. As Scarlett's thoughts spiraled, the sound of her phone ringing broke through her reverie. She answered it without thinking, her voice flat, almost mechanical. "Scarlett," the voice on the other end said. It was an old family friend, someone from the town she had left behind. The name didn't even register at first, but then the words hit her like a punch to the gut. Your mother and grandmother. They're struggling. Things aren't good. Helen's health has taken a turn for the worse. She's not doing well at all. We thought you should know. Scarlett's heart froze. For a moment, there was nothing but silence on the other end of the line. The words didn't seem to make sense. Her mother, her grandmother, sick, struggling. It felt like the world had suddenly shifted under her feet. The call ended, but the silence that followed was deafening. The walls of her apartment, once so comforting, now seemed cold and suffocating. She had thought she could leave it all behind, move forward without ever looking back. But the truth was undeniable. Her past, her family, would always be a part of her. No matter how far she ran, no matter how much she tried to bury it, she couldn't escape the truth. She stood up abruptly, her legs shaky, her mind racing. The apartment felt suddenly too small, too confined. She hadn't spoken to her mother in years, not since she left, not since that day. And now her mother was sick, possibly dying, and she had no idea how much time had passed, how much had been lost. She had chosen wealth over family. She had chosen to build a life without them. And now she had to face the consequences of that decision. For the first time in years, Scarlett felt something stir deep within her. A flicker of remorse, a spark of the woman she used to be. The woman who loved her family. The woman who had once cared more about others than her own selfish desires. She couldn't ignore it anymore. The guilt was too heavy. The call to return was undeniable. Without thinking, she grabbed her coat and her keys. She didn't know if it was too late to make amends, or if her mother and grandmother would even want to see her after all these years. But she couldn't sit in this empty apartment anymore. Couldn't live with the regret any longer. She had to go. She had to try. As she rushed out of her apartment, the weight of the decision hit her again. What was she going back to? A broken family? A past she could never reclaim? And yet, she couldn't stay here, living a life that meant nothing, haunted by the ghosts of the people she had abandoned. The door to the apartment clicked shut behind her, and for the first time in 2 decades she felt like she was heading home. Scarlett's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, the familiar road stretching before her as she made her way back to the town she had left behind 20 years ago. The trees lining the street seemed unchanged, as if time had frozen in her absence. The houses, the shops, everything was the same, and yet nothing felt familiar anymore. The town had once been her world, a place full of memories, laughter, and love. But now it felt like a stranger's place, an unfamiliar land she had long ago abandoned. She wasn't sure what she had expected. Perhaps a warm welcome, maybe some relief from the burden of guilt. But deep down, she knew that wasn't going to happen. Not after all the years of silence, of making no effort to reconnect, of choosing to walk away from the people who had loved her. As she drove past the old houses, the old corners of her childhood, a sinking feeling settled in her stomach. She was approaching her mother's house now, the house she had left behind. It stood at the end of the street, as if waiting for her, but it looked different now somehow. The once vibrant paint was peeling, the garden overgrown with weeds. The house wasn't the home she remembered. It was a shadow of what it used to be, a ghost. Scarlett slowed the car, the weight of regret pressing heavily on her chest. She had always told herself that leaving was the only way forward, that she was doing the right thing. But now, looking at the house, it all felt wrong. She had left her family behind, her mother, her grandmother, everything. And for what? a life that was full of excess but empty of meaning. She parked the car at the end of the street, just out of sight of the house, and sat there for a moment, frozen. The world outside her car window seemed distant, muffled. Her heart raced as memories of her childhood flooded her mind. The warmth of family dinners, the laughter in the kitchen, the quiet moments with her grandmother as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset. But all of that was gone now, replaced by years of distance, silence, and regret. The sound of her phone buzzing in her pocket broke her out of her thoughts. It was a text from an old friend, someone who still lived in the town. It was short, simple. People are talking. They know you're back. Everyone's asking about you. The words stung. Scarlett hadn't thought about the town's reaction, about how they would view her after all these years. Would they see her as the woman who had abandoned her family for a life of luxury? Would they judge her, whisper behind her back? She had built a life that was about appearances, about success. But now all of that seemed hollow. The judgment of her old community was like a heavy cloud hanging over her head. With a deep breath, she forced herself to step out of the car. Her feet felt like lead as she walked toward the house. The front door was still there, the same door she had slammed shut 20 years ago. It felt like an eternity since she had last crossed that threshold, yet the memories of her final moments in the house were still vivid, fresh. She could still hear her mother's voice, soft but firm. "You'll always have a place here." Those words had haunted her every day since. But now she wasn't sure if they still held any weight. As she reached the front door, her heart pounded in her chest. She hesitated before knocking. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure what to expect. What had changed? What had happened to her family in her absence? Would they welcome her back, or would they turn her away, as she had once turned them away? The door opened slowly, and there stood her mother, Helen. The years had not been kind to her. She was older now, her face lined with age and hardship, her once vibrant eyes now dull with exhaustion. She looked at Scarlett for a long moment, her expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, like an impenetrable wall. "Mom," Scarlett whispered, her voice barely audible, but Helen didn't respond. She simply stepped aside, allowing Scarlett to enter, her stoic silence speaking volumes. Inside, the house was quieter than she remembered. The warmth of family had long since faded, replaced by an emptiness that settled in the corners of every room. Linda was sitting in a chair by the window, her eyes fixed on the outside world, but when she saw Scarlett, she stiffened. The pain in her eyes was unmistakable, a deep, aching wound that had never healed. "You came back," Linda said, her voice low, trembling with emotion. "After all these years, you finally came back." There was no warmth in her tone, no sign of forgiveness, only the raw pain of a woman who had been left behind. Linda's eyes bore into Scarlett, and for a moment she felt like a child again, standing before her grandmother, waiting for approval that would never come. "I'm sorry," Scarlett whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her regret. I didn't know what else to do. I thought it was the only way." Helen's voice interrupted, steady but full of quiet authority. "You thought it was the only way. But did you ever stop to think about what you were leaving behind?" The question hung in the air, a painful reminder of everything Scarlett had abandoned. Her mother's words cut through her like a blade, each one a reflection of the years she had wasted chasing an empty dream. There was no immediate forgiveness, no rush to bridge the gap of time that had come between them. Helen did not welcome her with open arms. Instead, she stood in the silence, watching her daughter, waiting for something Scarlett didn't know how to give. Linda, too, held her silence. Her pain was raw, evident in the way her hands clenched tightly in her lap, as though trying to hold on to something that had long since slipped through her fingers. There was no anger in her eyes, only the deep sadness of a woman who had loved and been abandoned. The tension between them was palpable. Scarlett, desperate for forgiveness, tried to explain herself, tried to justify her actions, but the words felt hollow, even to her. She had left. She had made the choice. And now, all she could do was stand in front of the people she had hurt and try to make sense of a life that no longer made sense. But there was no forgiveness here. Not yet. Only the quiet, unspoken understanding that the past could never be erased. And in that silence, Scarlett realized that the road to redemption was not as simple as returning to the people she had once loved. It was going to take more than words. It was going to take more than regret. And so, they stood there, a family torn apart by time and distance, trying to find their way back to one another through the cracks of their shared pain. Scarlett had always believed that she left because it was the only way. The only way to escape the suffocating weight of responsibility. The only way to build a life beyond the walls of the house she had been raised in. To move toward a future that felt full of promise. But the more she stayed, the more she realized just how little she knew about what had happened that day. The day she left. The day she made the choice that would change everything. It was one late evening when the truth came crashing down on her like a thunderstorm. She had returned to the house for another uncomfortable conversation with Helen and Linda, trying to explain her actions, trying to find the words that could repair the damage. But Helen's silence and Linda's bitter gaze were constant reminders that no words could undo the past. She had just finished speaking when Helen, in her quiet, steady way, dropped a bombshell. It wasn't about forgiveness. It wasn't about what Scarlett had done or left behind. It was about the truth, the hidden truth. "You weren't the only one who made the decision, Scarlett," Helen said softly, her eyes never leaving the floor. "There was someone else who made sure you would leave, someone who manipulated you, and you fell for it. You were just a pawn in their game." Scarlett froze, her heart skipping a beat. She had thought the decision was hers alone. She had convinced herself it was for her own good, that she was doing what was best for her. But now, the words hung in the air like a poison. Someone else had been behind it. Someone in her family had set the stage for her to walk away. And Scarlett, in her youthful naivety, had been blind enough to believe them. "Who?" she whispered, barely able to speak. "Who made me think this was the only way?" Helen didn't answer right away. She seemed to be gathering the strength to speak, as though revealing the secret would open a floodgate of memories she had long buried. Finally, she spoke in a voice so quiet that Scarlett had to lean in to hear her. "Your father," Helen said, her voice thick with bitterness. "He wasn't the man you thought he was. He had already made up his mind about what was best for you, and when he saw you getting close to leaving, he convinced you it was the only way. He didn't care about you. He cared about what that house represented to him, about the money and the control." Scarlett's heart sank. Her father, the man she had always thought of as strong, as a protector, had played a part in her abandonment. The man who had always been the anchor in her life, the one who had promised her the world, had actually been the one to push her away from everything that mattered. The truth hit her like a cold slap to the face. She had been manipulated, used as a pawn in a game of power and control, and she hadn't even realized it until now. All those years she had spent telling herself that she was better off, that she had done what was best for herself. None of it was true. She had been duped. She had been part of a conspiracy to destroy her family. The weight of that realization crushed her. It wasn't just guilt that she felt now. It was betrayal, deep, raw, and suffocating. Betrayal not just from her father, but from herself, for believing in the lies he had told her. She had turned her back on her family, thinking she was doing what was right. But in reality, she had been playing into a game she hadn't understood. And the cost had been devastating. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. How could she have been so blind? How could she have trusted him? How could she have abandoned her mother and grandmother for a lie? She wanted to scream, to rage against the injustice of it all. But the truth was undeniable, and the more she tried to fight it, the deeper the shame sank into her soul. As the hours passed, Scarlett stayed in the house, wandering from room to room, as if looking for some kind of explanation, some kind of redemption. She tried to talk to Linda, tried to apologize for everything, but Linda's silence was a wall that she couldn't break through. Every word she spoke felt empty, hollow. The years of abandonment had left deep scars, and nothing Scarlett said could undo the damage. Finally, she went to Helen, who was sitting quietly on the couch, her hands folded in her lap. Helen was watching her, her eyes filled with quiet understanding, but there was no softness there. There was no warmth, just the cold, hard truth that had always been present between them, buried under the weight of years of silence. "I'm sorry, Mom," Scarlett said, her voice breaking. "I didn't know. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was escaping. But I didn't know about all of this. I didn't know what was happening behind the scenes." Helen didn't speak at first, her eyes just holding Scarlett's, as if weighing everything she had said and done. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she spoke, her voice low and steady. "You didn't know because you didn't want to know. You were so focused on your own life, your own future, that you didn't see what was right in front of you. You didn't see that the man you trusted had already decided your fate long before you ever left." The words cut through Scarlett like a knife. She had thought she was strong, independent, free from the past, but now she saw how weak she had been. How easily she had been swayed by someone who had never cared for her, never cared for what was best for her, but only for his own gain. The guilt surged again, a tidal wave of emotion she couldn't stop. She had left her family to chase a dream, to escape, and in doing so, she had let herself be led by someone who never had her best interests at heart. She had abandoned the two women who had loved her unconditionally, who had given everything for her. And for what? For a lie? For wealth and status that had meant nothing in the end? Scarlett collapsed to her knees in front of Helen, her body shaking with the weight of her regret. She hadn't realized how much she had lost until now. She hadn't realized how much of herself she had sacrificed in the process. And now, in this moment, it felt like it was too late to fix it. Too late to undo the years of damage. Too late to heal the wounds she had created. Helen didn't move, didn't comfort her. She just watched, her face set in lines of quiet resignation. She had lived through the pain. She had lived through the silence. She had lived through the betrayal. "The years are lost, Scarlett," Helen finally said. "But that doesn't mean you can't try to make something of what's left. That doesn't mean you can't try to rebuild what's been broken. But it won't be easy. It will never be easy, and you will never be able to undo the past." Scarlett's sobs filled the room, but even as the tears fell, she knew that Helen was right. The past couldn't be undone. The years of abandonment, the lies, the betrayal, they had all left scars that couldn't be healed with words alone. She had to prove her remorse, her regret through action. She had to rebuild her relationship with her family from the ground up, one small piece at a time. But as she sat there, crying in front of her mother, she realized something else. She wasn't just mourning the years lost. She was mourning the woman she had been. The woman who had been so easily deceived, so easily misled. She was mourning the person she had become, and wondering if she would ever be able to find her way back. And with that thought, the truth hit her harder than ever. She had been betrayed. She had been manipulated. And now, she was left to face the consequences. The days following the revelation of the truth were heavy with the weight of regret. Scarlett knew there was no easy fix. no magic words that would make everything right again. But for the first time in years, she understood what it meant to truly seek forgiveness, not just through words, but through actions. And for her, that meant giving up the life she had so carefully built, the life she had once thought was everything. She stood in front of the mirror one evening, looking at herself, at the reflection of the woman who had once been so confident, so certain of her path, the woman who had walked away from her family, thinking that wealth and status were the measures of success. But now, looking at herself, she saw nothing but the emptiness of a life built on the wrong foundations. There was no pride left in the woman she had become. Only guilt, only the desperate desire to undo the damage she had caused. The decision came quietly, in the stillness of the night. Scarlett knew what she had to do. She had to humble herself. She had to give up the things that had once defined her, the things that had led her to abandon her family in the first place. She had to show them, show everyone, that she was willing to sacrifice everything to make things right. The next morning, she walked into the small, modest shop that her mother and grandmother had kept running for years. It wasn't much, just a little store on the edge of town, selling simple goods to the community. Scarlett had visited the shop often as a child, but she had always looked at it with disdain. Too small, too humble, too far beneath the life she had thought she deserved. But now, standing in front of it, she felt a strange sense of peace. "I want to help," Scarlett said softly, her voice barely a whisper. Helen and Linda were there, as they always had been, tending to the shop, but they barely looked up. They had been so used to her absence, to her indifference, that it was hard to believe this was real. "Help?" Helen asked, her voice laced with caution, yet tinged with something else. Maybe a flicker of hope, or maybe just the curiosity of whether this time Scarlett would truly follow through. "Yes," Scarlett said, her eyes steady on her mother's face. "I want to work with you. I want to rebuild what I destroyed. I know I can never undo the past, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make amends. I don't care about the wealth, the status, the career. I don't care about any of it. I just want to be here with you, helping." "I owe you that much." Helen didn't speak right away. She just watched Scarlett with a guarded expression, weighing her words, weighing her sincerity. Linda, on the other hand, had crossed her arms, her face softening only slightly. It was clear she was skeptical, unsure whether this was just another empty promise. The pain in her eyes was still fresh, still raw. The years of abandonment hadn't been forgotten. "You think working here will make up for everything?" Linda finally spoke, her voice edged with bitterness. "You think you can just show up after all this time, after what you did, and make it all go away?" Scarlett's heart clenched at the anger in Linda's voice, the disbelief that still lingered. But she couldn't back down now. She couldn't walk away like she had before. "No," Scarlett said, her voice firm but trembling. "I don't think I can make it all go away. I can't change what I've done, but I can try, and I'm here to try, for as long as it takes." Helen remained silent for a long moment, her gaze never leaving Scarlett. Then finally she spoke, her voice measured, heavy with the years of pain she had carried alone. "You want to help?" Helen asked. "Then show me. Show me that you're not just doing this to ease your conscience. Show me that you're willing to put in the work, that you're willing to stay." Scarlett nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She didn't expect it to be easy. She didn't expect forgiveness to come in the form of warm embraces or kind words. But this was the beginning, the first step, and she had to take it, even if it meant facing the anger and the hurt she had caused. For the next few days, Scarlett worked alongside her mother and grandmother, doing everything from stocking shelves to cleaning the windows, to taking care of the customers who came in. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest. It was real, and with every passing day, Scarlett felt the weight on her shoulders slowly lifting, piece by piece. She wasn't just working to fix things. She was working to rebuild the bond she had torn apart. The community, at first, watched with curiosity. Whispers filled the streets. Whispers about Scarlett's return. Whispers about her sudden change. Some people were skeptical. Some people were downright hostile. They didn't understand why she had left in the first place, and they didn't know if they could ever forgive her for abandoning her family. But Scarlett didn't care. She didn't care about the gossip, the judgment. She cared about one thing and one thing only: making things right. And slowly, things began to change. The whispers of forgiveness started to spread. People started noticing the way she was working alongside her family, the way she was putting in the effort, not just talking about it. They started to see the sincerity in her actions. It wasn't just the work she was doing that changed people's minds. It was her willingness to humble herself, to step down from the pedestal she had once placed herself on, and to live a life of honesty and humility. Scarlett became a symbol of redemption in the community, not just for her family but for everyone who had been watching from the sidelines. People began to see her not as the woman who had abandoned her past, but as the woman who was willing to face her mistakes head-on. The whispers turned into conversations. The conversations turned into forgiveness, and Scarlett began to see the walls that had been built between her and her family slowly start to crumble. It wasn't fast. It wasn't easy. But every day, every small act of kindness, every moment of humility, was another step toward healing. The rift between them was still there, but it was no longer as deep. It no longer felt insurmountable. One evening, after a long day of work, Scarlett sat with Helen and Linda at the kitchen table, sharing a simple meal. The air between them was still thick with unspoken words, but there was something different now. There was a quiet understanding, a recognition that they were all trying, in their own way, to move forward. Helen looked at Scarlett across the table, her eyes softer than they had been in days. "You're here," she said quietly. "That's a start." And for the first time in years, Scarlett felt a glimmer of hope. It was small, but it was there. She wasn't just asking for forgiveness anymore. She was earning it, one day at a time. The days had passed since Scarlett had humbled herself, since she had committed to working alongside her family, trying to rebuild the trust that had been shattered by years of silence, betrayal, and regret. And yet, despite her best efforts, a lingering uncertainty remained. She knew deep down that the road to redemption wasn't just about doing the work, showing up every day, and making small amends. There was one last step to take, one final test that would determine if she had truly changed, or if all of this had just been an attempt to ease her guilt. It came one evening, as Scarlett was helping Linda in the back of the shop, sorting through some old inventory. The sun had just set, casting a warm glow through the window, but there was a chill in the air, a quiet tension that had been building over the past few days. Helen had been distant, her silent, watchful presence never far from Scarlett. She had observed her daughter's every move, her every action, but there had been no words of affirmation, no gesture of forgiveness. Not yet. Then it came. Scarlett had been asked to take over the shop for a few hours, while Helen and Linda went to visit an old friend. It wasn't unusual, but tonight something felt different. The town had been buzzing with rumors of Scarlett's return, and the whispers had grown louder. People were starting to look at her differently, some with curiosity, others with disdain. But in the quiet of the shop, it was just her, the shelves of goods, and the ever-present weight of her past. The doorbell rang, signaling a customer's arrival. Scarlett looked up, expecting another familiar face from the community, but what she saw instead made her stomach drop. It was Michael, her ex-husband, the man who had convinced her to leave her family in the first place. The man who had manipulated her into believing that she needed to cut ties with her past to move forward. The man who had, in the end, played a part in her downfall. She froze. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Michael hadn't changed much. He still wore that same self-assured smile, the one that had once charmed her into believing he was the answer to all her problems. He looked around the shop, his eyes scanning the humble surroundings, and then he looked at her. "Scarlett," he said, his voice smooth, almost too casual. "I heard you were back. I have to admit, I didn't think you'd come crawling back to this life. But here you are." The words stung, more than she had expected. There was no warmth in his voice, only a cold reminder of everything she had lost, everything she had walked away from. He was the reason, the instigator, and now he was standing in front of her, as if nothing had ever happened. "What do you want, Michael?" Scarlett asked, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "I'm not the same woman you remember. You don't get to judge me anymore." Michael chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Oh, Scarlett, you've always been a piece of work. I don't need to judge you. You've already judged yourself. Look at you, working in this rundown shop, trying to make amends for something you can never fix. It's pathetic." Scarlett's heart pounded in her chest. The anger surged, but she held it in. She had no time for him, not anymore. Not after everything. And yet standing there, facing him, she realized something profound. This was her test. This moment would define whether she had truly transformed, whether her repentance was real. Could she walk away from the past, from the man who had helped ruin her life, and hold true to the woman she was becoming? She looked at him, her face hardening, and her voice was quiet, but firm. "I'm not doing this for you, Michael. I'm doing it for me, and for the people I've hurt. You can't take that away from me." Michael's smile faded slightly. He wasn't used to being spoken to this way, not by her. But he recovered quickly, his eyes narrowing. "You really think you can make this right? You think you can fix everything with a few days of hard work?" He took a step forward, his voice lowering, almost a whisper. "You'll never get their forgiveness. They'll never see you as anything more than the woman who left them. I know that, and deep down, you know it too." The words cut through her, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't the same woman who had left all those years ago, blinded by ambition, by the false promises of a better life. She had learned what it meant to face the truth, to own her mistakes no matter how difficult. And this was it, the test. Could she stay true to her decision, even in the face of her past? "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Scarlett said, her voice steady. "I'm asking for the chance to earn it, to prove that I can be better, and if you think you can stop me, then you're wrong. This is my redemption, not yours, not anyone else's." The confrontation with Michael left her drained, but there was a strange clarity in her soul. The weight that had been pressing on her for so long seemed to lessen, just a little. She wasn't going to let him dictate her worth anymore, and for the first time in years, she felt like she was finally standing on solid ground. Later that evening, Scarlett went to Helen, who was sitting quietly in the living room. Linda was absent, likely out in the garden, giving them space. Scarlett stood in the doorway, her eyes searching her mother's face. Helen's expression was unreadable, her face lined with the years of struggles and sacrifices she had endured alone. "Mom," Scarlett said softly, taking a step closer, "I need to talk to you." Helen didn't look at her at first, but the weight of her daughter's words seemed to pull her gaze upward. Scarlett's heart raced as she knelt in front of her mother, taking her hands in hers. "I'm sorry," Scarlett whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry for everything I've done, for leaving you, for abandoning you both. I can't change the past, but I want to prove that I've changed, that I can be someone you can count on, not just for now, but for the rest of my life." There was silence. Helen didn't speak for what felt like an eternity, but then, finally, she lifted her head and met Scarlett's eyes. The strength in her gaze was undeniable. "Forgiveness," Helen said quietly, "isn't about words. It's about actions. It's about showing, every day, through your work, your humility, your heart, that you understand what you've done. Helen paused, her hands still in Scarlett's. You can't undo what's been done, but you can rebuild, and that's what I'm asking of you, to rebuild. The quiet words settled between them like a balm, the weight of the past lifting just a little. Scarlett nodded, feeling the truth of her mother's words deep in her bones. In that moment, something began to shift, something that couldn't be put into words. The healing had begun. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. The walls between them, the barriers built by years of pain and betrayal, had started to crack. The family bond wasn't restored overnight, but as Scarlett continued to work alongside Helen and Linda, as she showed up every day, humbled and determined, the trust began to rebuild piece by piece. The sacrifice she had made wasn't just in her actions. It was in her heart, in her willingness to face the truth and work toward something greater than herself. The family bond would never be the same. But in that quiet healing, in that simple, quiet promise of action over words, there was hope, and that hope was enough to begin the journey back to each other.